Kentucky and Georgia square off, and they are in surprising situations. Not because they're in one drastically better than the other. It's just that I don't think anybody expected either of them to be where they are right now. Kentucky is the underdog, obviously, still undefeated after a big win over Florida, and Georgia is one of the best teams in college football still, despite some of their struggles. We'll take a look at both teams, what they need to do, and the keys to the game. We'll also make a prediction later on and see who wins this game and why they win. Kentucky's really interesting because when you came into last week, there were some, including myself, that thought Florida definitely could win this game. I thought that Kentucky had a good chance. They were undefeated, so there was a chance they were going to win, but I don't think we saw, I don't think anybody saw last week coming. We didn't see Ray Davis going off for 200 yards in the first half. You didn't see this offense look really explosive running the football. But playing Florida and playing Georgia are two different games, different tests, different expectations. And I think that Kentucky has a lot of exciting pieces that they can utilize. And now the question is, can you play against the back-to-back national champions? Can you find a way to pull off an upset? Because this one, I guarantee you, nobody outside of Lexington expects the Wildcats to win this game. That doesn't mean that they can't. I just don't think anybody expects them to do that. Now, if they're able to pull this one off, I think you're looking at a an absolute crazy result, one that we'll be talking about for a while. And certain players like Ray Davis and Devin Leary will play an impact. There's also some defensive players that we'll talk about later that will play a role as well. And this defense is playing really well. They're holding teams to just 75 yards rushing per game. They're limiting them to 4.56 yards per play. Their offense, while it hasn't been the most consistent, is explosive. They're averaging 7.19 yards per play. Last week helped that tremendously, especially on the ground. And they're creating havoc on defense. I think that's the biggest thing for Kentucky is their ability to disrupt this offense. Because one thing we saw from Georgia is that they are not the Georgia of the last 2 years. This is a team that's still very much figuring things out. And if Kentucky can find ways to create some turnovers and get their offense more opportunities, then you start seeing a chance for them to potentially pull off an upset. Georgia's really interesting because a lot of people just assumed that they were going to be really good, and it's easy to see why. Why wouldn't they be? Kirby Smart has done a great job of recruiting. He's done a great job of getting his talent to elevate their game. They just haven't felt the same as they have in the past. Now, there is something to be said about what Carson Beck is doing, taking over for Stetson Bennett. Maybe not as much of a leader as Stetson Bennett was, at least not yet. And that could play a role in why they're struggling. This is a kid who is still very much learning what the college game is like, what it's like to be the leader on one of the best teams in college football. And give them some time, and I bet you they figure it out. Unfortunately, they don't have time to figure it out against a Kentucky team that very much would like to pull off an upset against the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, this offense is still scoring at a decent rate. They're averaging 38.6 points per game. They're also creating some explosive plays too. I think the biggest thing is finding ways to get Brock Bowers more involved. 413 yards and 3 touchdowns so far. You'd like to see him get more touches. There's certain players that when you need a play to be made, you give it to them. And Brock Bowers is one of those guys. So if Carson Beck can find a way to get the ball to him, I think you're in good hands. On the defensive side of the ball, there's a lot of talent. I just don't know what the ceiling of that talent is quite yet. You're still lacking that go-to playmaker like a Jalen Carter was for them, but they have plenty of talent. Guys like Tyke Smith are having a good year. You look at Jamal Dumas Johnson, you look at Jamon Dumas Johnson, and then Smail Munden. You have so many guys, and I think that right now there's a lot of pressure on them to win, and you have to stay hungry. And right now, Georgia doesn't appear to be as hungry as they were in the past. But if you give them time and hit them in the mouth enough, you'll definitely wake up what has been a giant in college football. When you look at these two teams head to head, it's easy to see why this game is so exciting and has so much potential. The quarterbacks will play a role, and we'll talk about them more in a little bit. But there are plenty of other matchups that you have to pay attention to. I think the wide receivers play a huge role in this game for Kentucky. Their ability to open up the offense for the Wildcats will determine how successful they'll be. Because again, this Georgia defense hasn't been as good as we expected, but they're still really good. It's not like they fall off the face of the earth. They're still really talented. So guys like Barian Brown, Dane Key, Tavion Robinson have their hands full and play a huge role in helping Devin Leary move the ball through the air. Kamari Lassiter and Tyke Smith will most likely pair up with some of those guys, and those are players that could play at the next level. And that will show us for both sides how far these teams have come, how far they have to go, and certain talented players like Brown and Key for Kentucky get to showcase what they can do in a big game. Because I think a lot of people just expect Georgia to take care of business. It may not be the prettiest win, it may not be the most dominant win, but they expect Georgia to take care of business. One way to kind of negate that or just refute that is by throwing the football well. And so far, Kentucky hasn't been the best at doing that. The wide receivers play a role. Keeping Devin Leary upright also plays a role. And Marquez Cox plays a big role in that too. Keeping guys like Micah Williams away from his quarterback will play a huge role. And this is a talented Kentucky offensive line, but you're also facing an extremely talented front seven for Georgia. Georgia will try to find many ways to send pressure, simulate pressure, give different looks to mess with Kentucky's offense. And if you're able to figure out what you can do to combat that, then you're in good hands. Going on the other side, I think an absolute big time battle is going to be Deone Walker versus Cedric Van Pran. These are two guys that will play at the next level. Cedric Van Pran could have gone pro this past year, but decided to come back. Deone Walker is an absolute stud for Kentucky up the middle. And right now, Kentucky could use a good run stuffer against a Georgia team that is still trying to figure out how to run the football a little bit more efficiently. They have plenty of talent to utilize. The offensive line is very good, but guys like Deone Walker will give them trouble. And if they're able to force Georgia to try and throw the ball more, that maybe puts them in a better position to get stops. I think that they have plenty of talent on this front seven to be able to do that. But it comes down to what guys like Walker can do to slow down this rushing attack for Georgia. Because if Georgia becomes one dimensional, I don't necessarily know if they can handle doing that. I don't know if they're capable of handling that kind of adversity. We will see what happens, but you have to be able to stop the run first. And then whoever's guarding Brock Bowers has their hands full, whether it's Trayvon Wallace. I think Trayvon Wallace is one of the more underrated players in college football still, but he has his hands full in Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is an extremely talented pass catcher. He's very physical as a blocker. He does a little bit of everything for this offense, and finding ways to get him more involved could play a huge role in Georgia's success. Keys to the game for Kentucky. I think you have to find balance, like we've mentioned before. We're kind of harping on this because that's how important it is. You will not beat Georgia by running the football like you did against Florida. You might be able to pick up some good chunks, but you have to find a passing attack. It's simply 69 yards for Devin Leary won't get the job done 2 weeks in a row facing Georgia. That's really what's going to happen. That being said, you have to get Ray Davis going too. I think that running the ball is still very important, but you have to be able to open up the field. You cannot allow Georgia to stack the box. You cannot find ways to give them football. You have to be ready for that. And a big way to do that is prepare for a battle at the line of scrimmage. Georgia has so much talent, and Kentucky essentially just has to be ready for a war. This is going to be a tough game for Kentucky, regardless of how prepared they are or not. Even if they are ready for this game, beating Georgia requires a special type of performance. And if you're able to open things up on the offensive side of the ball, that puts you in better hands. And if this defense, specifically the front seven, can find a way to slow down this Georgia offense, then I think that Kentucky has a decent chance. Georgia creating big plays will be the key. Right now, I think Carson Beck plays with some confidence at times, and other times he looks very lost and very unsure of what he's doing. If you find ways to open up the offense and give him just some easy, confident throws early on, finding ways to hit his talented players will play a huge role in his confidence when the second half comes rolling around. Loading the box could be a big key here too. Right now, if I'm Georgia, I don't necessarily respect what Kentucky's doing in the passing attack. I don't necessarily know if I put in a ton of extra guys in the box, but you're definitely going to load it up and force Devin Leary to beat you. Devin Leary's not having his best season, so maybe you force him, you dare him to beat you and see what happens. And then setting the tone. Last time we saw these two teams play, Georgia essentially hit Kentucky in the mouth, and they were not ready for that. They were not prepared for an absolute battle, and that's what this game is again. And if Georgia can set the tone early and knock Kentucky back, then maybe the Wildcats aren't ready for that, and maybe that makes things easier for the Bulldogs. Now, finally, the quarterbacks will play a huge role. I think both of them have some questions and both of them can prove some things. Devin Leary, a few years ago, threw 35 touchdowns and just 5 interceptions. He's already at 5 interceptions for the year, and they haven't exactly played elite defenses. So that maybe is concerning when you're facing a team like Georgia, especially after last week. Obviously, the rushing attack did its part, but you're not going to be able to throw for 69 yards, like I said, and expect to win this game. You have to find a way to be more accurate, and you have too much talent at the wide receiver position to not be better than you are. On the flip side, Carson Beck also has to do certain things. Now, his numbers look a little bit more impressive, but again, you haven't really faced a defense that exactly it gives you the fear. You have to be able to step up in big games. And right now, Carson Beck hasn't had a ton of opportunities to do that. So it's not completely on him, but you have to find ways to step up and make an impact on this game because Kentucky is very talented and they have nothing to lose. This is definitely a Georgia team that should win this football game, but it's definitely a scenario where Kentucky can win, can pull off the upset. If I'm picking this game, I'm obviously going with Georgia. It feels like Georgia, despite its struggles, is still very much the better team. I don't think there's any debate about that. And if Kentucky finds ways to create some disruptive plays, to create some turnovers and let this offense get more chances to score, then I think you're in good hands. But right now, it feels like Georgia is just too talented. The gap between these two teams is too great, and the Bulldogs will walk away undefeated.